Hello, this is my final project for our social change project. The problem I chose was the disproportionate amount of minority students, specifically African American students, who receive harsher punishments than their white counterparts. As we learned from our book, a problem has to have both an objective and a subjective element in order for it to be considered social. So objective being the existence of the social condition. We have research that confirms that although minorities make up the smaller amount of their schools, they have the highest amount of discipline issues. This is obviously a problem. Why is there this huge disparity between the amount of students that are enrolled that are minorities, making up the largest amount of students who have disciplinary issues? And mainly those issues or the things that they're getting in trouble for are quote unquote disrespect, non-participation, non-compliance, which are generally interpreted by the teacher. So there's room for error there. The subjective element, it's particularly harmful to the minority communities, specifically in schools, because we know that there is the school to prison pipeline. We've learned that students who receive punitive discipline multiple times are more likely to get in trouble again. They're more likely to drop out. And these students are then involved in the delinquency programs or juvenile system. And then also with the zero tolerance policy that schools have accepted and implemented, they're bringing quote unquote safety guards to school, which typically is the same thing as a CO at a prison. They're there, they're in uniform, they have, weapons that are deemed appropriate for school, but they're there to make sure they keep law and order. They're there to make sure they are pulling people out of classroom who are not doing what they're supposed to do. And they're just kind of introducing these kids, specifically minorities, as they're the ones getting in trouble the most, to the prison system. Who does this problem affect? It affects obviously the minority students. They have a higher chance of being seen as misbehaving, and then because the discipline is more often than not punitive, the likelihood of them getting in trouble again is even higher. And students who get in trouble in school are less likely to graduate and more likely to become involved with law enforcement in their life. Also, the schools are affected. Schools who have higher documented behavior problems are deemed as bad schools. So parents who would have the money or the resources to dedicate to something that would be called a school issue are choosing to send their kids elsewhere. And then research has shown that the higher amount of uneducated people, the higher the likelihood that they are living in poverty or that they are dealing with poverty. And as we know, poverty also brings on an increase of crime. The cause and contributing factors to this social problem: economic disadvantage. As I said before, parents who can afford to can take their kids elsewhere. So if they see that they are something that they believe is a problem at the school, they have the time, the money, the resources to dedicate to fixing that problem, whereas someone who is economically disadvantaged does not. Also, underfunded schools. Schools are way underfunded. So they don't have the resources to be able to deal with, these behavioral problems, to deal with the cultural and ethnic differences that they have and how behaviors are being interpreted. But also teachers are completely underpaid. So it's easier to throw a problem away or get rid of a problem in your classroom versus actually taking the time to dedicate to a student or to figure out what's going on. It's important to mention the historical oppression of minorities, specifically African Americans, as they have been deemed as less than or unequal to their white counterparts. And even though, people would say, oh yeah, well, we're not segregated anymore and everyone's treated equal, it's important to note that the institution of school was created at a time where African Americans were deemed not the same as white people. They were a lower class. They weren't even considered citizens. And this the school system was built during this time and has continued to be built on this, which leads to one of the biggest problems we see is racial bias, whether implicit or intentional. Obviously, if you have an intentional bias or you have a bias against another race, then you're more likely to, think that they're being disrespectful or rude or whatever it is. But the main issue is the implicit racial bias. And I pulled a quote from one of the articles that I read, talking about the difference in punishments between white students and African American students, is that institutionalized racism reflects prevailing attitudes that tell us who is intelligent, who is simple-minded, who is up to no good, and who is well-intentioned, who deserves a break and who deserves to be made an example of. And this is maybe the study showed that it may be the root of the discipline disparities that we see with students of color, because their actions are constantly being interpreted by their teacher, and that racial bias is playing a role in the way that they choose to discipline their students. Who is advantaged? I already talked a little bit about that school to prison pipeline. So obviously the juvenile delinquency systems and programs, the prison system, corporations who are backing them, private prisons, things like that, they're getting a steady flow of students who, you know, once they become involved in the delinquency in the juvenile system, they're more than likely to become involved into the criminal justice system as well. Also, members of government and corporations and schools, etc., who accept bribes or monies to cooperate with these systems. So there was 2 quotes from an article that I read at the bottom, that Florida privatized its juvenile prisons. So they were funded by the state, but they were run through corporations. And then also that a Pennsylvania judge was convicted of accepting bribes to send children to these juvenile prisons. So people are able to take bribes, or these major corporations are backing, you know, people in our government, people on our school board and things like that, but that money has to be repaid somehow. And obviously they're not going to invest a huge amount of money into something such as, you know, equalizing those disciplinary actions with minorities and with the majority if it's going to take away from the money that they're making. Who is disadvantaged? Naturally, it's the ethnic minorities, specifically African American, and every study that I was reading and every article that I'm quoting showed that African American students get the brunt of these quote-unquote disciplinary practices. And then also the minority communities and families. Again, it perpetuates and gets bigger and bigger in regards to dropouts and poverty and crime. And a quote from one of the books that I read, data from the U.S. Department of Education shows that black students, who comprise 16%, make up more than a quarter of students referred to law enforcement, and 31% are arrested for school-related incidents. And also, in a study from 2011 to 2012, the black students were 3 times more likely to be suspended and expelled than their white peers. This is poverty is also another issue, so I thought that this picture was interesting and relevant to add in here, because poverty has a large effect on whether or not students graduate, whether or not they continue on and go into higher education. So you can imagine a minority student who is already, you know, receiving or has the likelihood to receive more disciplinary actions, but then add poverty in there, and it really looks like there's just no way for that student to be able to succeed. How is this issue framed for the public? Quite frankly, we know that institutionalized racism is a real thing, and I feel like those who are in power are benefiting from the institutionalized racism. So this is such a huge problem specifically for minorities, because they know that the likelihood of them getting in trouble and dealing with disciplinary issues is higher. However, those in power are choosing to just ignore it, and the way that it's framed is just, oh, we have a zero tolerance in schools, which is very similar to the war on drugs. It disproportionately affects minority students. However, it's still not being changed, and it's still being implemented. Also, they're claiming that, oh, the large amount of minority students who are affected commit more offenses, which isn't necessarily true, and minority students make up the smallest part of the population, so that's not a correct calculation. And also those on the Board of Education, in the government, in our system, as I said, have the ability to change it, but they're choosing not to. So how can we solve this problem? The first one would be self-regulation technique. This study from Sweden quoted that research has concluded that conscientiousness or self-regulation has predictive power to later educational outcomes for students. So self-regulation, helping students to be able to control their behavior, giving them tools to be able to, you know, notice when they're feeling out of control, to be able to think through their actions beforehand instead of immediately trying to address it or trying to go in at the situation. You're more than likely going to get a negative result. So by giving students these tools to self-regulate, they're less likely to get in trouble. The biggest way to fix this problem, I believe, in something that I'm a personal fan of and that we implement in my school, is restorative justice practices. So on the right, it kind of tells you a little bit about restorative justice. It's being able to include all the stakeholders in the decision making, including the victim, the offender, the community, letting them know, you know, we see you, we see this mistake that you made. This is the fact. This is the truth of what happened from both parties. This is how you affected your community and this person, and how do you make it right? It's letting them know that they're, the things that they do wrong, their mistakes, their issues, don't define them as a person, and that they have a way to be able to fix the situation. So by doing punitive discipline, as schools have been doing, removing the students, suspensions, expulsion, it's not helping that person do better and fix the problem. And the quote in the middle from the academic journal that I read, it said there's considerable evidence that restorative approaches can result in reduced suspension and expulsion, decreased disciplinary referrals, improved academic achievement, and other beneficial results. So this is really giving students the life tools, realistically, to be able to right their wrongs, to be able to fix and restore and care about their community and their fellow students. That way they want to be in class, they want to be there, and it's not, oh, I know if I act up, I just get to leave anyways. It's really creating that sense of belonging for that student. And the last way, which is the most difficult way, is more behavioral training for teachers. And the last way, more behavioral training for teachers and staff. Obviously, it's really difficult when the government keeps taking from the education budget. Who knows what would be more important than the future of our nation? But the fact remains that schools are underfunded, and so teachers who are dealing with children who are ethnically and culturally different from them don't have the tools or the techniques to be able to determine, are they trying to be offensive? Are they trying to come off as disrespectful? Are they trying to be non-compliant? They don't have the tools to differentiate the two. But this study here from an academic journal that I read, they trained staff to use the strategy greet, stop, and prompt. And this was done in 3 separate schools. A few hours of training for the staff. There was weekly coaching and following up for them. But just by doing the greet, stop, prompt, they cut their office referrals in half, which is a huge, increase in, obviously something is going right, and obviously implementing this had a very big positive effect for them. And it was as simple as greeting and acknowledging the students, getting to know them, giving students time to talk to their teachers, not just because I'm in trouble, but really getting to know them. So that way when the student is worked up, or when the teacher is worked up, they can practice the stop portion, where students aren't really able to regulate themselves like we are as adults. When they're upset, they're upset. But they will respect the teacher enough to stop and to give them that pause. But also for the adult, they need to pause and they need to know, are they doing this to be disrespectful? Did they mean it the way that I'm interpreting it? So practicing that stop, and then the prompt, giving simple corrections to the student, labeling what was inappropriate about their behavior. Even if it was the way that a teacher took something, they could speak to the student about it and label it as inappropriate for that teacher, and then not just say it was inappropriate, but also offer appropriate behaviors instead of that. And then last, giving the kids choices and letting them be a part of that. So that way we move from punitive to restorative. We're moving from, you did something wrong and you did this, so you need to get out or you need to leave. They're instead being able to build relationships and respect with their classmates, with their classroom, building that sense of community. They're able to also increase decision making in the students. Now they know for next time, I can't say something this way, or I can't do this. My teacher told me I can do X, Y, Z. Those are the things that I'm going to do instead. That way it's not just, oh, you did something wrong, leave the classroom, and pushing that person away. It's giving them the tools to be able to stay in the classroom, and even though behavior problems will never be solved, it's still being able to give them an equal fighting chance to redeem themselves. And last, I did want to make sure that I cited all of my references, all of the articles that I was going through to collect this different research. I wanted to make sure that it is cited here. And that is the end of my presentation.